The Axis Illusion, Germany and Japan before Midway. June 1942 had not yet revealed itself as a turning point. In Berlin, confidence still lingered in the air. The Wehrmacht had survived the brutal Soviet winter. Though the drive to Moscow had failed, Germany remained deep inside Soviet territory. The summer offensive was being prepared. Maps covered tables in the High Command. Oil fields in the Caucasus were marked as the next objective. Officers spoke of decisive breakthroughs. To many in the German leadership, the war still appeared controllable. Across the globe, Japan seemed to confirm that belief. Since December 1941, the Empire of Japan had moved with astonishing speed. Pearl Harbor had shocked the world. In Berlin, the attack was celebrated. Hitler, who had already been fighting Britain for over 2 years, saw the strike as proof that the Anglo-American powers were vulnerable. Within days, he declared war on the United States, convinced that conflict with America was inevitable anyway. Japan's early campaign strengthened that conviction. Hong Kong fell. Malaya collapsed. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in February 1942. More than 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops were captured. It was one of Britain's greatest military humiliations. German newspapers highlighted every Japanese victory. Propaganda framed Japan as the unstoppable hammer of the East. The message was clear. The Anglo-American world was under assault from 2 directions. But behind the rhetoric, the alliance was limited. The tripartite pact signed in 1940 had united Germany, Italy, and Japan in principle. Yet there was no integrated command structure, no shared operational planning. Communication between Berlin and Tokyo traveled through diplomatic cables and occasional military attachés. Each power fought its own war, guided by its own priorities. Still, perception mattered. Hitler believed that if Japan could keep the United States occupied in the Pacific, American strength would be divided. A 2-front global war would strain even a giant economy. Germany, he calculated, needed time to defeat the Soviet Union and consolidate control over Europe. In the Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, officers studied Japan's use of aircraft carriers with professional interest. Germany had never completed a functioning carrier fleet. The Graf Zeppelin remained unfinished. The German Navy was built around submarines and surface raiders, not carrier aviation. Japan, by contrast, had mastered it. The attack on Pearl Harbor had demonstrated the striking power of coordinated carrier aviation. 4 of the carriers involved, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had performed with precision. Their pilots were experienced, highly trained, and battle-tested in China and across the Pacific. In Berlin, few fully understood how central those carriers were to Japan's naval strength. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood. Yamamoto had studied in the United States years earlier. He knew American industry. He reportedly warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that he feared the industrial imbalance would become overwhelming. His strategy aimed at delivering decisive early blows to force negotiation before American production reached full capacity. Pearl Harbor had been bold, but it had not eliminated the U.S. carrier force. The American carriers had been at sea during the attack. They survived. That fact weighed heavily on Japanese planners. By May 1942, Japan had extended its defensive perimeter across the Pacific, but American resistance was stiffening. In April, the Doolittle raid struck Tokyo with a small force of American bombers launched from the carrier USS Hornet. Though militarily minor, The raid shocked Japanese leadership. It proved that the home islands were not untouchable. Yamamoto responded with a plan to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive trap near Midway Atoll. In Berlin, none of these details were fully visible. German intelligence had limited insight into Pacific operational planning. Yet optimism remained strong. Japan's navy had not lost a major carrier. Its pilots had not suffered catastrophic attrition. To outside observers, it appeared dominant. Within the German high command, focus remained on the east. Operation Blue was being finalized. The Wehrmacht would split Army Group South, pushing toward the Volga River and the oil fields of Baku. The belief was simple: seize Soviet oil and the Red Army would wither. Cut the Volga and Soviet logistics would collapse. Confidence was fragile but present. American industrial mobilization was known but underestimated. Reports indicated shipyards expanding, aircraft factories accelerating. Yet many German officers believed that America lacked the fighting spirit for a prolonged continental war. The memory of World War I influenced these assumptions. The United States had intervened late then. Perhaps it would struggle again. Japanese rapid advances seemed to reinforce that narrative. There were dissenting voices. Some economic analysts warned that American steel production dwarfed that of any Axis power. Intelligence suggested that new aircraft carriers were already under construction. But in early 1942, those ships were still months away from service. The present reality appeared to favor Japan. And so, as June approached, Berlin's mood remained cautiously hopeful. The Eastern Front demanded attention. North Africa required reinforcement. U-boats prowled the Atlantic with growing success. Every sinking reported off the American coast was celebrated as proof that the United States was vulnerable. Few in Berlin understood that events were unfolding in the Pacific that would quietly alter the trajectory of the war. Midway was not yet a word that carried weight. It was a small atoll in a vast ocean, a speck on a map. But in early June 1942, 4 Japanese carriers sailed towards it, confident, experienced, and central to Japan's offensive power. Within days, that confidence would vanish. And when the news finally reached Berlin, the illusion of Axis momentum would begin to crack. The day the Pacific turned, the Battle of Midway. By late May 1942, the Pacific Ocean had become a chessboard. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan was bold, complex, and risky. He intended to seize Midway Atoll, a small American outpost northwest of Hawaii, and force the United States Navy to respond. Once the American carriers appeared, they would be surrounded and destroyed. With the U.S. carrier fleet eliminated, Japan would dominate the Pacific long enough to consolidate its empire and fortify its defensive perimeter. At the heart of the plan were 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were not ordinary ships, they were veterans of Pearl Harbor. Their air groups had struck British bases, American positions, and targets across Southeast Asia. Their pilots were among the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Yamamoto believed surprise would once again ensure victory. But this time, surprise was gone. In a basement room at Pearl Harbor, American cryptoanalysts had been working for months to break Japan's naval toad, known as JN-25. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo managed to identify Midway, coded as AF, as the next target. To confirm it, they devised a simple deception. Midway sent an uncoded message reporting a water shortage. Soon after, Japanese communications intercepted by the Americans referred to AF experiencing water problems. The trap was exposed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, made a decision that would shape the war. Instead of retreating or waiting defensively, he would ambush the Japanese carrier force. Though outnumbered, the Americans would fight on ground of their choosing. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, were positioned northeast of Midway. Yorktown had been damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea only weeks earlier. Japanese intelligence believed it had been sunk. They were wrong. In an extraordinary repair effort at Pearl Harbor, workers restored it to operational status in just 72 hours. On June 4, 1942, the battle began. Before dawn, Japanese aircraft launched from their carriers to strike Midway's airfields. The attack caused damage but failed to eliminate the island's defenses. American land-based aircraft, including Marine Corps fighters and torpedo bombers, launched in response. They attacked the Japanese fleet in scattered waves. The results were devastating against the Americans. Outdated torpedo planes flew low and slow toward heavily defended carriers. Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire tore them apart. Squadron after squadron was annihilated. Torpedoes malfunctioned or missed entirely. Pilots were shot down in flames over open water. From the Japanese perspective, the battle seemed to be unfolding favorably. On the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, crews worked quickly. After the first strike on Midway, commanders debated whether to launch a second attack on the island or rearm aircraft to strike American ships that had been sighted. The decision process created confusion. Bombs were swapped for torpedoes, fuel lines were open, aircraft crowded the hangar decks. It was a fatal moment. Late in the morning, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived overhead. They had struggled to locate the Japanese fleet. Some had nearly run out of fuel. By chance and by courage, they descended at exactly the moment Japanese defenses were disorganized. In just a few minutes, the course of the Pacific War changed. Dive bombers from Enterprise struck Kaga. Multiple bombs ignited fuel and munitions. Flames engulfed the ship. Soryu was hit almost simultaneously. Fires spread uncontrollably through her hangars. Moments later, Akagi, flagship of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, was struck by a single bomb that penetrated to the hangar deck. It was enough. Fueled aircraft erupted in explosions. The carrier's fate was sealed. Within 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were doomed. The sudden reversal stunned Japanese commanders. Only Hiryu remained operational. Determined to retaliate, Hiryu launched 2 counterstrikes. Japanese aircraft found the Yorktown and scored multiple hits. Fires broke out. The carrier appeared crippled. For a brief moment, it seemed the balance might tilt back. But American scouts located Hiryu that afternoon. Dive bombers attacked once more. Hiryu was hit repeatedly. By evening, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks. The cost was immense. Japan lost not only ships but irreplaceable experience. Hundreds of trained pilots and crewmen perished. Carrier aviation depended on skill developed over years. Unlike ships, pilots could not be built in factories. The United States also suffered losses. Yorktown, damaged in the battle, was later sunk by a Japanese submarine. Aircraft and pilots were lost. But America's industrial capacity remained intact. New carriers were already under construction. Midway was not merely a tactical defeat for Japan, it was strategic. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese expansion was halted decisively. The offensive momentum that had begun at Pearl Harbor was broken. From this point forward, Japan would increasingly fight defensively. In Tokyo, the shock was profound, yet information was tightly controlled. The scale of the defeat was not immediately disclosed to the public. Surviving ships retreated. The Japanese Navy faced a reality it had not anticipated. The United States could strike back and win. Thousands of miles away, Berlin remained focused on its own campaigns. But when reports filtered through diplomatic channels that 4 Japanese carriers had been destroyed, German analysts began to ask hard questions. Carrier warfare was complex. Germany had little direct experience with it, yet naval officers understood the implications. 4 major fleet carriers lost in a single battle represented not just defeat, but a structural weakening of Japan's naval power. The question forming quietly in Berlin was simple. If Japan could not eliminate the American fleet in 1942, what would happen when American shipyards reached full production? The Pacific had turned in a single morning. And although the guns had fallen silent over Midway, the echoes were about to reach Europe. Shockwaves in Berlin. Hitler learns the news. In early June 1942, Berlin was consumed by its own war. Operation Blue was underway. German forces were pushing deep into southern Russia, driving toward the Volga and the Caucasus oil fields. Reports from the Eastern Front dominated briefings. Hitler spent long hours studying maps, shifting divisions, arguing over objectives. The Soviet Union remained the central battlefield in his mind. The Pacific felt distant. Yet by mid-June, fragments of troubling news began to arrive through diplomatic channels and intelligence summaries. At first, the information was unclear. Japanese naval losses near Midway, conflicting reports, ships damaged, aircraft destroyed. Then, confirmation came. 4 fleet carriers lost. For the German leadership, this was not a minor event. Even if the Pacific was not their theater, Japan was their ally. Its strength indirectly shaped Germany's strategic position. Every American ship tied down in the Pacific meant fewer resources in Europe. Every Japanese victory strengthened the illusion that the Anglo-American powers could be divided and exhausted. Now that illusion was under strain. The news reached the German Foreign Office before it reached the wider military structure. Communications between Berlin and Tokyo were formal and often cautious. Japanese officials did not immediately disclose the full scale of the disaster, but naval attachés and intelligence intercepts gradually revealed the truth. At the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, analysts assessed the implications. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Not small escort vessels, not aging ships. These were front-line strike carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor. Their loss represented a dramatic reduction in Japan's offensive capability. Within the Kriegsmarine, the reaction was sharper than in the Army High Command. German naval officers understood the value of capital ships. They had struggled for years with limited surface fleets and resource constraints. They knew how long it took to construct and equip a major warship. More importantly, they understood the training cycle required for carrier aviation. A carrier was more than steel and engines. It was a floating air force. Admiral Erich Raeder reportedly viewed the defeat with concern. Germany had never fully committed to carrier construction. The unfinished Graf Zeppelin symbolized that failure. Now Japan, the one Axis power that had mastered carrier warfare, had suffered a crippling blow. When Adolf Hitler was briefed, his reaction was complex. He did not erupt in anger, nor did he display visible panic. Witness accounts suggest he viewed naval warfare as secondary compared to land campaigns. His strategic thinking was rooted in continental conquest. Armies decided wars. Oil fields, railways, cities, these were tangible objectives. Carriers operating in the vast Pacific seemed abstract by comparison. Yet Hitler was not blind to industrial realities. He understood that the United States possessed enormous production potential. He had long believed that America lacked political unity for sustained war, but by 1942, that assumption was already eroding. The destruction of 4 Japanese carriers raised a disturbing possibility. The United States was learning quickly. Joseph Goebbels recorded observations in his diary reflecting unease. Publicly, German propaganda minimized the defeat. Newspapers framed it as a temporary setback. They emphasized Japanese resilience. Official statements stressed that the overall strategic situation remained favorable. Privately, however, doubt surfaced. German military intelligence had been tracking American industrial expansion. Reports indicated massive shipbuilding programs. Essex-class carriers were under construction. Aircraft production numbers were climbing rapidly. American steel output dwarfed that of the Axis powers combined. If Japan had failed to eliminate the U.S. carrier fleet in mid-1942, the window for decisive victory was closing. Some officers within the German High Command began to reassess timelines. The war could not be prolonged indefinitely. The United States was mobilizing on a scale unprecedented in history. Shipyards operated around the clock. Liberty ships were being launched in days rather than months. Midway suggested that time favored the Allies. However, within Army circles, the focus remained on the East. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and others prioritized Soviet collapse. If Germany could defeat the Soviet Union in 1942, the strategic equation would change. American industry would matter less if continental Europe were fully secured. Hitler clung to that logic. He believed that a decisive victory in Russia would force Britain into isolation and weaken American resolve. Japan's setback, though serious, did not alter his immediate objectives. The summer offensive would continue. Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields became obsessions. Yet among more analytically minded officers, the broader picture was unsettling. The Axis strategy depended on rapid, sequential victories. Germany would defeat the Soviet Union, Japan would neutralize the United States, Italy would secure the Mediterranean. Instead, each front was stabilizing, resistance stiffened, resources stretched thin. Midway marked the first major strategic defeat for Japan. It did not end the Pacific War, but it shifted momentum. In Berlin, the realization came slowly. The question was no longer whether Japan could win quickly, it was whether the Axis could win at all before American production reached overwhelming strength. By late June, reports confirmed the scale of Japanese pilot losses. This detail alarmed naval observers most of all. Experienced carrier aviators were irreplaceable. Training programs could not easily replicate years of operational experience. The German Navy had faced similar challenges with U-boat crews. Skilled commanders were invaluable. Losses reduced effectiveness quickly. Japan now faced that same attritional reality. Still, there was no immediate policy shift in Berlin. Hitler remained fixated on the Soviet campaign. The belief persisted that victory in the East would compensate for setbacks elsewhere. The Pacific was distant, the Eastern Front was immediate. But in quiet offices within the High Command, a subtle shift occurred. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan no longer appeared invincible. And if Japan could be stopped in the Pacific, then perhaps Germany could be stopped in Europe. The shockwaves from Midway did not produce public alarm in Berlin. There were no dramatic speeches acknowledging crisis, no visible signs of panic. Instead, there was something more dangerous, a quiet awareness that the balance of the war might be changing. And while Hitler turned his gaze toward Stalingrad, the long shadow of American industry began to loom larger in the calculations of his generals. History. What the generals really thought. By the summer of 1942, the public face of the Axis alliance remained firm. Official communiques emphasized unity. Newspapers continued to describe Germany and Japan as partners reshaping the world order. But inside the conference rooms of the German High Command, the tone was more restrained. Midway was not dismissed. It was studied. Within the Kriegsmarine, officers analyzed the battle with professional seriousness. Germany had limited experience with aircraft carriers, but naval warfare was a shared language. The destruction of 4 fleet carriers in a single engagement was unprecedented. It raised uncomfortable questions about doctrine, coordination, and vulnerability. Some German naval officers quietly concluded that Japanese operational security had failed. Surprise had been Japan's greatest advantage at Pearl Harbor. At Midway, that advantage had vanished. The Americans had known enough to prepare an ambush. That meant Japanese codes had been compromised, or American intelligence had achieved a breakthrough. Either possibility was alarming. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, viewed the war through the lens of attrition. His submarines were inflicting heavy losses in the Atlantic during early 1942, in what became known as the Second Happy Time. American coastal defenses were initially disorganized. Tankers and merchant ships were sunk in significant numbers. Yet Dönitz understood something fundamental. Industrial wars favored the stronger economy. He had already warned that submarine production and trained crews would determine success in the Atlantic. The same logic applied to the Pacific. If Japan could not replace its lost carriers and pilots quickly, the initiative would pass permanently to the United States. In private discussions, some German officers compared their own limitations with Japan's position. Germany had struggled for years to complete a single carrier, the Graf Zeppelin. Resource shortages, shifting priorities, and internal disagreements had delayed it indefinitely. Japan, by contrast, had built a formidable carrier fleet before the war. And still, that fleet had suffered a crippling blow in one morning. The lesson was clear. Modern naval warfare was unforgiving. Among senior Army officers, the reaction was more analytical than emotional. They asked whether Midway would free American forces for Europe. Would the United States accelerate its buildup in Britain? Would greater naval security in the Pacific allow more material to flow into the Atlantic theater? Intelligence estimates suggested that American production was expanding beyond earlier projections. Aircraft factories were producing thousands of planes monthly. Shipyards were launching new vessels at unprecedented speed. The Essex-class carriers under construction would soon outnumber Japan's remaining fleet carriers. For the first time, some German planners began to consider the possibility that the United States might sustain simultaneous offensives in multiple theaters. There was also skepticism, quiet but present, about Japanese strategic judgment. Germany and Japan were allies, but not closely coordinated ones. There had been no joint planning for Pearl Harbor, no integrated grand strategy. Each pursued its own objectives. Some German officers privately questioned whether Japan should have avoided provoking the United States directly and instead focused on consolidating gains in Asia. Others believed the opportunity had already passed. War with America was likely been inevitable. Hitler himself maintained public confidence in Japan. He continued to express belief in Japanese resilience, but he increasingly emphasized Germany's need to achieve decisive results independently. The Eastern Front became even more critical in his thinking. If Germany could crush the Soviet Union before American power matured, the balance might still be salvaged. Yet the generals understood the timeline was tightening. Midway demonstrated that the United States could defeat elite Japanese forces. It was not a fluke skirmish, it was a strategic reversal. The myth of unstoppable Axis momentum had been punctured. There were no official minutes recording dramatic admissions of doubt. German officers were disciplined, cautious in their words. But war diaries and post-war interviews reveal a pattern. Midway marked the moment when confidence in Japan's ability to neutralize the United States began to fade. The alliance had always been more symbolic than operational. Now its practical value seemed uncertain. And as 1942 progressed, events elsewhere would compound those doubts. Stalingrad loomed. El Alamein approached. American troops were training in Britain. Midway was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader shift, one that German generals were beginning to perceive. Quietly, without public declaration, some began to wonder whether the war had reached its high water mark, and whether the tide was turning against them. The beginning of the end. Midway's global consequences. In the immediate aftermath of Midway, the world did not yet understand its full significance. Battles continued, armies advanced, headlines shifted quickly, but beneath the surface, the strategic landscape had changed. For Japan, Midway ended the era of rapid expansion. The initiative passed gradually to the United States. 2 months later, American forces landed on Guadalcanal. What followed was a brutal campaign of attrition. Japan, once advancing across thousands of miles of ocean, was now fighting to hold ground. For Germany, the implications were indirect but profound. The Axis strategy had depended on speed. Germany would defeat the Soviet Union before American industrial might could be fully mobilized. Japan would cripple the U.S. Navy long enough to secure dominance in Asia. Italy would stabilize the Mediterranean. Instead, by late 1942, each pillar faltered. At Stalingrad, German forces became trapped. In North Africa, the Africa Corps faced mounting pressure. In November 1942, American and British troops landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch. The United States was no longer a distant industrial giant, it was an active combatant in multiple theaters. Midway had helped make that possible. By stabilizing the Pacific Front, the United States gained strategic flexibility. Shipbuilding surged. Escort carriers protected convoys. Industrial output reached levels that stunned even Allied planners. By 1943, American production of aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and aircraft outpaced all Axis powers combined. German generals watched these developments with growing concern. Post-war testimonies reveal that many senior officers recognized 1942 as the turning year, not because a single battle decided everything, but because momentum shifted irreversibly. Midway, Stalingrad, and El Alamein formed a chain of events that ended Axis expansion. Hitler never publicly conceded such a turning point. He continued to believe in decisive counterblows, new weapons, renewed offensives, but the structural imbalance had become undeniable. American industry was a force of its own. The 4 carriers lost at Midway could not be replaced quickly by Japan. Meanwhile, American shipyards launched new carriers at accelerating speed. Pilot training programs expanded. Technological improvements followed. Radar, improved aircraft design, logistical coordination, each advantage compounded over time. The Axis powers faced the opposite reality. Resource shortages intensified, fuel constraints limited training, replacement crews were less experienced, strategic flexibility narrowed. Midway symbolized more than naval defeat. It represented the moment when the initiative passed permanently to the Allies. In Berlin, that realization matured slowly. It was not announced, it was not formalized, but it influenced calculations. Defensive considerations increased. Contingency planning grew more urgent. By 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, the imbalance that began revealing itself in 1942 was overwhelming. American troops, ships, aircraft, and supplies flowed across oceans in staggering numbers. Looking back, historians often describe Midway as the turning point of the Pacific War, but its consequences reached far beyond the Pacific. It altered strategic confidence in Tokyo. It unsettled calculations in Berlin. It signaled that the United States, once attacked and underestimated, had adapted and was mobilizing its full power. The 4 burning carriers in June 1942 marked the end of Axis expansion. From that moment forward, Germany and Japan would fight not for victory, but for survival. And though the war would rage for 3 more brutal years, the balance had shifted. The tide that turned at Midway would never turn back.